Welcome to episode 9 of my new podcast, Why Didn't Anyone Tell Me This? With my guests, we are discussing health issues, questions you may have, and debunking some of the myths around our health. And today we are speaking to Marieke Bigg. She is the author of a new book called This Won't Hurt: How Medicine Fails Women. And it's absolutely fascinating. So I can't wait to get talking about it. So, a bit about Marieke. She writes books about bodies and culture. She holds a PhD in sociology from the University of Cambridge, where she studied the technological transformation of human reproduction. She now writes both non-fiction and fiction about the cultural dimensions of biology and bodies. In addition to her books, she writes freelance, hosts podcasts and panels, and collaborates with scientists and biologists to discuss and produce art that conjures new social worlds. So, welcome, Marieke. Let's start
Hi.
by hearing about your career and what led you to work in this area.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks so much for having me on. So I suppose my career in this area started with my PhD. I studied um, a particular scientist actually who was really instrumental to the development of in vitro fertilization, and I looked at her role in the debates around human embryo research in Britain. So that really set me down this track of looking at human reproduction, women's bodies in society. And after I finished my PhD, I suppose a few personal experiences really got me thinking about medicine more generally. So I outline one of these experiences in the book. I went to see a gynecologist, and he made some comments that I just found quite jarring and a bit confusing. They just sort of sat weirdly, and I couldn't really explain why. I left feeling quite numb, I suppose. And just thinking about them, I started to draw on some of the kind of sociological perspectives I'd discovered during my PhD, and found that they really helped me make sense of the things this gynecologist had said, things about, when will you be having your first baby, that kind of stuff. Um, and I found it really helpful and really sort of enabling and validating to see my own experience in the context of sexism more generally. And I wanted to share that perspective with women, to validate their experience. And after that realization and starting writing the book, just every time I spoke to a woman, she would have a story to share. And that really just, animated me on the path to writing this book, just how many experiences there are out there of medical sexism. So that's really, how I sort of got into this area and how it all began.
And my research now has also led me to talk to women and listen to their stories. And there are so many fascinating discussions to have. Can we just go back to your PhD? So the person you studied was an amazing hero of mine as
Mm.
well. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about her?
Yeah, sure. So her name is Anne McLaren. And she was just such an incredible person. I was really interested in her, not just for her scientific contributions, but just the kind of breadth of the things she worked on, and her approach to science. So she worked across, the fields of reproductive science, genetics. She contributed to stem cell research, all sorts. But she was also, her early life was really interesting. She grew up in London, kind of amidst social circles of socialists and scientists. Her mother was a bit of a socialite, and starred in an H.G. Wells film early on in her life, which shows mice being sent to space. And then later in her scientific career, she worked with NASA to send mice into space. She was a Marxist. She was collaborating with with Russian scientists during the Cold War when that was really not done. She, and my focus in my research was on her role in public policy making. So she was just really good at translating science for non-scientists, figuring out what kind of concerned people when it came to science, and trying to find the scientific facts that spoke to that. So really taking people's concerns seriously and explaining the science to them so that we could move towards finding, a consensus when it comes to, quite controversial areas like human embryo research. So I just really admired her approach, her really collaborative, really kind of social approach to science.
I was exactly the same. She was a great mentor for me. She really supported every woman that she ever met. She always used to say, if you need anything, if you need me to write a reference or give any support, she was there. And I never actually worked with her, but she was always so willing to help anyone. She was an amazing woman and a big loss. I would love to have interviewed her, but she's left a great legacy, and it was great that you were able to study that. Um,
Yeah.
so one of my aims as well is to help women understand what is normal. But as you explain in your really terrific book, we have done so little research on women, and it is such a travesty. And in some cases, we still in 2023 are not really sure what's normal. And you go through a lot of this in your book. I really like the sections where you wrote about the clitoris. I retweeted that beautiful image yesterday, and a
I
few people
saw,
remarked.
yeah.
It's
Great.
just such a great image, and it's not a little bud. um, and female orgasms as well. It's so amazing that we're understanding this at this stage. But I want to jump right into some issues that you really discussed that I think our listeners would really like to talk about. And it's something that we really don't talk about. And we should talk about all of this. And that's female ejaculation, is where I'd like to start. So again, I wrote about this in my book in the chapter on sex. And your chapter gave me some information I really wasn't aware of, which is unbelievable. So we often look up to the work of Masters and Johnson, but they ignored female ejaculation, even though it was recorded, as you said, in ancient texts such as the Kama Sutra. So please tell us more.
Yeah, I also found that really, um, yeah, interesting, I suppose, to discover that in their work, they did some really groundbreaking research, showing that, for example, women can have multiple orgasms, this kind of thing. So really breaking with kind of traditional understandings of male and female sexual kind of response and behavior, and challenging some of these norms. But when it came to female ejaculation, they just dismissed kind of these observed this phenomenon. And what I found quite sort of ironic about it was that they dismissed it on the basis that they thought women were misunderstanding their own response, their own bodies, and interpreting this fluid through the lens of male normal sexual response. So they were saying, women are just only used to hearing about male sexual response, and that's why they're interpreting this as ejaculation, when really they were interpreting this phenomenon through a really kind of heteronormative view. So they completely dismissed, this phenomenon, and that goes on throughout the science. I saw these, just researching these scientific debates around female ejaculation, and there's not much on it. It's, like you say, it's something that hasn't really been talked about very much. But in the scientific literature I did find, there's just this ongoing obsession with the chemical composition of the fluid. So For a long time, scientists denied that female ejaculation was a phenomenon at all. But then eventually, in the 1980s, you had some sexologists actually film this phenomenon. So increasingly, it was just kind of undeniable that this did happen. So it's almost like the scientific community, when sort of faced with this incontrovertible evidence, looked for another way to dismiss it and focused on the chemical composition and sort of debated whether this was a liquid, a fluid similar to male ejaculate, or if it was just urine. And time again, scientific studies have tried to show that it's just urine. And that idea has also traveled through kind of culture at large. I look at obscenity laws around pornography and how, they banned depictions of female ejaculation on the grounds that this fluid is mainly urine, and so that it constitutes something obscene, urolagnia, they call it. So it's just, it goes to show how these scientific ideas then reinforce very gendered ideas and heteronormative ideas about sex in society at large. And I think that's what this is all about, really. It's about kind of preserving this idea of, male dominated sex that revolves around male pleasure, male ejaculation, and this strange, outlandish finding that, women ejaculate too, and just how that kind of subverts this whole picture we have of sex in society.
It is what you've just said is so unbelievable. I mean, the whole thing about the pornography, I knew about that, but when I read it again in your book, it just made me so crazy. And I know there was another paper. I didn't read it because I knew I'd be angry. A paper came out earlier this year or the end of last year, saying, "Oh yes, it's urine." I've looked at it. I've smelt it. It's not urine. I don't think it's urine.
Yeah,
Doesn't smell like
yeah,
urine. Doesn't look like urine.
yeah,
And it's just amazing. I think you said 40% of women ejaculate quite
yeah,
regularly. And why don't we
yeah.
know what it is? Anyway, it's not urine. It's not,
I
yeah.
know.
Um,
Yeah, and also, even if it was, it's just this obsession with discussing, whether it's urine or not. What about the fact that, like you said, 40% of women report having ejaculated in their lives, and also that most of them say it had a really positive effect on their sex lives. It's, why are we fixated on proving what this liquid is and not on, how pleasurable it is for women?
and it should be celebrated. The men I know, think it's a fabulous achievement. Like, wow, I did it,
Yeah,
and to
yeah.
think anything else it's just unfair. It really is. It's unbelievable.
Mhm.
2023, and we're having to discuss this it's just mind blowing, as you've really beautifully detailed in your book. So I want to move on to talk about hormones, a very hot topic. And it's again amazing how little we know. And I loved your section on hormones and about how we think of male hormones and female hormones. And when we look even at some things that happen in the menstrual cycle, we have things like a hormone, FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. That's what they first thought it did, but it does other things. And these hormones are in both of us, both genders. So I also have an issue that you've talked about, which is medicalising women's health. And for me, one of the hot topics at the moment is menopause and treating menopause as a hormone deficiency disorder, giving women or saying women or every woman post-menopause should be taking hormone replacement therapy, including testosterone. And I really feel that we don't have some of the clinical trials and studies that need to be done. So we're treating women as guinea pigs. And I'm hearing more and more, oh, well, in our clinic, they say they feel better, but that's not proper research. That's not evidence-based medicine. So what do you think?
Mm. Yeah, I completely agree. This idea of medicalizing, you know, women's experience and not listening to women, about the role that these things actually play in their lives. Um, I think the menopause is something that hasn't received, a phase in a woman's life that hasn't received much attention. And I'm always wary of these interventions and how much they're about, actually supporting women in their health, and how much they're about kind of policing ideas of femininity. With the testosterone and HRT, I've heard a lot about, low libido, so how your libido might go down around this time and how it helps with that, which, also just makes me think, that is only a problem if a woman says it's a problem. And yeah, why are we medicalising? Why are we, prescribing hormones without an adequate understanding of what this actually means in women's lives? And, I'm sure that for some women, HRT in general, I know is really beneficial. And in those cases, women should have access. But it's so important to actually interrogate, what it is that we're trying to do here. As with female ejaculation, these discussions tend to just revolve around or fixate on certain kind of concepts. And I'm always just seeing that they're more about policing gender roles and ideas of femininity than they are about actual health. And like you say, with no proper clinical trials, no understanding of the long-term, safety implications of taking testosterone, what that could do for things like cardiovascular health, for example. I think, yeah, it's really irresponsible.
I think the companies, the drug companies, for them to have half of the population spend a third of their life on their drugs would be amazing. But I find that way too controlling. And as you say, I totally agree. For some women, HRT is their absolute lifesaver. And I'm sure that some women will benefit from testosterone, but we're all different. And this narrative of, oh, the
Mm.
menopause is so negative, and the only way you're going to lead a good life is to take HRT. And I've also heard a clinician say the only way you're going to be able to have sex post menopause was if you take
Mm.
HRT, which I just found so insulting and unbelievable. When I questioned him, he denied he'd said that, but that was his opening slide. That was very, very clear. Um, so you've also got wonderful chapters. I have so many questions about all of these chapters, but I think we'll just summarize them. So you talk about heart disease, osteoporosis, and cancer, and how we have really misunderstood and still misunderstand how these diseases affect women. What would be your overall thoughts on those issues?
Mm. Yeah, so I mean, those are some key examples there. Um, yeah, overall, it's a discussion, and I use these examples to show how, this male default in medicine has misled science, but also misrepresented um, just the facts for women in society, and not given them the information they need to make decisions about their health. So, in the case of heart disease, there's this misconception that um, heart disease is a male disease. Um, Women tend to think that, breast cancer poses a greater risk to them than heart disease, but heart disease is actually the number one cause of mortality in women. Um, so, there's a huge amount of misinformation around diseases in general when it comes to women. Also, there's a misunderstanding of how heart disease presents for women. So, a woman might not have the classic sort of symptoms we've seen, like chest pain, that men have. And doctors also sometimes confuse or easily confuse the symptoms of heart disease in women for the menopause, because they're quite similar. So things like sweats, hot flashes, this kind of thing. So, these gendered ideas about, what what diseases are, whether they're a male or a female disease, really mislead doctors in their diagnosis. I mean, women don't know when to go and get help. It's just overall dangerous. I also use this example in the chapter on heart disease of this app, that when men inserted their symptoms of heart disease, it told them to go to the hospital. And when women did the same, it told them they were stressed. I think the article was called something like, "It's not a heart attack, it's hysteria." So it's just how misinformation perpetuates this dismissal of women, and, is actually dangerous. And then, I mean, I'll skip to the cancer chapter, because I think that's a different dimension to the problem. So that chapter is a lot about who benefits from science. So I talk about this case of Henrietta Lacks, who was an African American woman with cervical cancer. And as she was being treated for it in the 1950s, the doctors took some of the cells from her uterus, and these ended up being used in medical research. It turns out that they were immortal stem cells, so they just kept replicating indefinitely, which is really, handy for researchers trying to experiment on these cells. But they were taken from her without asking her for permission, and then after she died, without, consulting her family. But they've become this sort of workhorse in science. They've led to all sorts of really important discoveries, not least the HPV vaccine. So that chapter is really about, who are the primary kind of contributors, donators in science, and who benefits from scientific discovery. And, the book as a whole is about how mainly men benefit, but really looking at, the kind of inordinate labor women do to kind of fuel and contribute to science really drives that question to a head. And it's also about, how do we actually give women a choice in healthcare? Because a lot of the discussions around the gender gap in medicine are about, inclusivity. So how do we include women in medical trials, or, female animals in animal experiments, which is all really important. But it's not just about that. We also need to take research done on women, and what that research shows us, to reshape how medicine is done. So we can't just include women and keep doing medicine in the same way if that way of doing medicine is really oppressive, if it means that, doctors get the final word, if it means that mainly men benefit from discoveries. So the issue of sexism in medicine is so much more kind of pervasive and insidious than just this question of, how do we include women in clinical trials? Although that is also really important.
I found it absolutely so fascinating, and obviously I was very very aware of the HeLa cells, and I think you said that her family now they could still start compensating them and getting more consent from them, but they haven't. They're not doing that. Is that right?
Yeah, well, there's these sort of tokenistic sort of like moments where, they try to kind of involve the family in decisions about how the cells are used. But what I saw was that they were just presented with, the option to stop using cells in research, or to allow them to be used in research. But that to me isn't really involving them in a discussion. That would require really understanding what the options are, what the potential, research avenues could be, what we could focus on, as a scientific community. Like, should we invest more resources into researching, I don't know, endometriosis or something else? So it's not enough just to present them with options and very little information about, what could be done. That to me isn't really involving them in decision making.
No, that's not. And through your book, you talk about how we do science, and we normally try to get funding from people, a
Mm.
governing body or a charity. And that really does frame how the science is done. And you've talked a lot about sexy science. And I think it's a really, really true comment. Some of the very basic science, because it's not sexy, such as you talked a lot about continuity of care, they are overlooked. And we spend energy on high tech procedures such as femtech and artificial wombs. And I found in some research that we've done, we asked teenagers in the UK and in Belgium what subjects they're taught at school. And we found that just a few percent have been taught about things like polycystic ovary syndrome or endometriosis. But they all are more often taught about genome editing and making eggs and sperm from stem cells, because those things are sexy. And endometriosis and PCOS are not sexy, but they're really, really important. So I wanted to explore now some of the sexy science that you talk about. And I've done
Mm.
quite a lot of work on femtech. And one of my big concerns is that we have some very well meaning people who are developing tech that, in my view, has no scientific basis, but it's sexy. And I really worry that we are going to overwhelm women with more myths about their health as these technologies come in. And I could give some examples, but I want to hear from you. What do you think about the femtech arena?
Yeah, I have similar concerns to you, I think. So, yeah, I mean, the very word femtech was coined by a Danish entrepreneur to kind of mitigate male discomfort around talking about reproduction, in the tech space. So I think that already says a lot, because when you can't talk about the thing, how are you going to design, apps or services that really, meet women's needs when it's still kind of taboo? Like, how much help can you really provide? And I think that's evident in just the focus of these apps. A lot of them are called fertility apps, and when they track menstruation, the assumption is that a woman would only want to track her periods in order to conceive, in order to have a child, when she might want to do it for many other reasons, related to her own personal health. So I think these assumptions, these kind of sexist assumptions, the same ones we see in medicine at large, are going to be written into these new, high tech interventions, when our underlying kind of assumptions haven't changed, without, these discussions about gender, about sexism. Nothing we do is going to make a difference. I think just generally we need to be really cautious about a kind of technological determinism. So this idea that new technology means progress, that's inherently progressive, that anything high tech is going to sort of change things for society. We really need to question what progress looks like, what it means. And for me, progress is more about social progress. So like you mentioned, continuity of care, this idea that having the same, midwife from, throughout the duration of your pregnancy and aftercare really makes a difference to women's health. Something like that is more progressive to me than, some new app that just reinforces the same gendered ideas.
I so agree. We've had this in the IVF setting for many, many years, where new technology is being developed all the time. And all of the studies on all of the technology has shown that they don't actually help, but it looks sexy and it looks great. And it makes the couple,
Mm.
vulnerable couple, think, oh, well, if I pay more money and have this new tech, then it's going to help. But we don't have any evidence for that. And then now seeing femtech and also the menopause field, I think we're just making this problem so much worse, because it looks, like you said, the technology looks great, sounds great. So women are going to feel that they need to use this. And I think it's really doing an injustice. And I really hate that we're almost conning women with this new tech. And as you said, tech sounds like it's going to help. And I think it's going to make things worse. So we've got an event tomorrow, actually, where people are pitching their ideas. So that's one thing I really want to talk about. And I always feel like I'm the bit of the killjoy, and don't want people to think that I'm against new technology. I'm really not against new technology, but I do think it needs to be evidence-based and have a good mechanism for working. And I'm seeing more things that I don't think will work than do. And they're being funded by venture capitalists because it sounds like a great idea. So
Yeah, completely. I mean, yeah, it's for me, it's just if the social, infrastructure isn't there, if we haven't thought about how we're using these technologies and who they serve, then we will probably end up doing more harm than good.
yeah, there was one treatment for the menopause where it was being suggested that we take ovarian tissue and freeze it when a woman's around 30, not with a view that she's going to sorry, use it to have children, but the view that when she's perimenopausal, she'll put back strips of the tissue and it would help with her hormones. If you are concerned about it and you feel you need treatment, there is HRT. So I said to the companies that have been doing this, I've said, well, have you asked women? Have you asked women that they would like to undergo this surgery?
Mm.
Have some of their ovary removed at the age when, if they do want children, they're probably going to be trying to have children, with the assumption that they're going to get such terrible menopausal symptoms that they would need to have this treatment done. And of course they haven't. And that very similar things in the IVF field where I've said the same. Have you asked women what they want? No. So whenever I'm talking to companies now that are developing things, my take-home message is speak to your target group. Who are they? And talk to them and find out what they want from this. So let's move on to artificial womb. So yesterday I recorded the podcast with Mats Brandstrom, who's the world pioneer of uterus or womb transplants, and we talked about artificial wombs as well, and how we would never say never, but it is that feeling of entering Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, a book he wrote almost 100 years ago, and here we are in this situation where we could we've discussed that being pregnant is a limiting factor for women. You've explained that really well in your book. So would it really be the feminist ideal to totally remove that from us, and we gestate the baby in a lab, in an artificial womb, and then we would be, on par with men? I mean, I personally don't think that, but I want to hear your thoughts before I say how I feel.
Sure. I think it's the same. It's sort of extension of the same discussion we were having about, any technology in medicine. Just once again, if the societal conditions aren't there, if we haven't thought about, who gets access, how, then we're just going to reinforce the same, status quo. So it's the same with artificial wombs. I think if we were to introduce them now into, probably at a hefty price tag, and only, wealthier women had access, and women who couldn't afford to use an artificial womb still had to bear children naturally, it could be incredibly harmful. It could mean that those women who still bear children naturally aren't, given the same or even less support than they are now medically, or that the, social infrastructure to support them totally disappears, as there's this assumption that women, are no longer bearing children, and it could really harm women. On the other hand, if we're thinking about, okay, how can we give all women access to this and present it, as an option for women who really need this as an alternative to natural childbearing, at the same time that we also still work on supporting women through childbirth or bearing in society at large, then it could be a really helpful thing. Also, with this artificial womb thing, I think it's really important to emphasize, it sounds really futuristic, and, people are often shocked to hear that, artificial wombs might be just around the corner. Initially, they would only be used for prematurely born babies. So, being born prematurely can lead to all sorts of health complications for the baby and the mother. It can be very dangerous, in fact. So initially, the ideas to use artificial wombs to support with that, which, I think could really save lives, and really help support women through, a really tricky, dangerous, taxing process. So I think, there's a lot of good to be gained from this, but it's always about how we implement these things.
Yeah, that's exactly what Matt said as well. And I agree, for medical reasons, there are some situations where it could be really beneficial. But as we've seen with surrogacy, I think we might end up with a class divide where some very wealthy women would feel, oh well, I've done enough of this. Let's put this in the artificial womb. So I think the ethical issues around or everything we've talked about is really something that's got to be considered. Now, you've written several other books. Can you tell us a little bit about them?
Yeah, well, so I also write fiction. So the fiction is, I mean, it's still, there's common themes. And I guess that's what you start to discover when you sort of write several things. You start to see these recurring themes reflecting, your interests. You learn things about yourself. So my fiction is also very centered on the body, embodied experience, what it, means to be a woman, and trying to bring, an experience that is unique to women in this world and really underrepresented in literature, to the page. So my first novel is called Waiting for Ted. It's about a woman just waiting for her partner to come home, and it follows her over the course of an evening, and awaiting him at home, naked on a chaise longue, and weird things start to happen. So yeah, I do a bit of that, sort of, quirky sort of literary fiction, writing. Yeah, and besides that, I also work with artists and scientists, to produce artwork that kind of, in again in this space, very connected to the book, thinking about how we can imagine society and the role of new technologies, new reproductive technologies in society, and how we can include everyone in decision making on that. So that's, definitely another big interest of mine.
I'm looking forward to reading that book. You've definitely tempted me. And I love
It's
the
weird.
good, I can't wait. I love the marriage of art and science, and I've dabbled a
Mm,
little bit in the past. And I think it's so important. So keep up your great work, please. Now,
thank you.
have you heard anyone say, "Why didn't anyone tell me this?" And what did they say?
Mm, yeah. I mean, love this sort of title. I definitely, I hear it a lot when I discuss the book with people, you know, often around symptoms. So like the symptoms for, a heart attack in women. And when you talk to women about that, they say, how did I not know this? How did I not know that this is how, it presents? But I guess it really sort of, what I really connect that kind of, that feeling, that sentiment to is, just this. I think when I talk to women about these issues, there's this kind of light bulb moment often where you realize you're not alone. I think that's just the strongest kind of feeling that emerges from those discussions. Is just that women really still feel very isolated, in their problems, when they go to a gynecologist and they don't feel heard, or a doctor and they feel dismissed. And just this idea that, there's other women having very similar experiences. And it's something we're talking about more now. It's better documented than it used to be. But it's just this idea that you kind of have to uphold this kind of perfect femininity, and that any, deviation from that is your own failing, is so ingrained that I think it's just still such a surprise to me as well when I speak to other women and I realize I'm not alone in that.
Yeah, perfectly put. And I find I'm spending so much of my time debunking myths. It's something that I've even got on my bio and some of my social media, debunking myths. And I find it frustrating that I have to spend time doing this rather than educating. And I think
Mm,
your book really sums that up, because every chapter you're debunking more and more myths that we've had around women's bodies and women's health.
Well, yeah, I mean, I respect the work you're doing there. It's really, it's a full-time job, isn't it? Debunking myths.
It's very frustrating. So one of the questions I ask all of my guests is about what motivates them, because I'm doing a lot of work, especially I think for the postmenopausal women. Some of them have lost their mojo, they've lost their motivation, they've lost how to feel happy. So I'd like to start with asking you, what motivates you?
I mean, partly, you know, that kind of recognition when I talk to other women. I think that's a huge part, just realizing that there's this kind of hidden community of people, I mean, half the population, who have similar experiences and feel the same way. And it really motivates me when I sort of talk about these things and I have, you know, my own experience is validated and I can see that other women feel the same. And it just gives me a lot of hope that if we keep talking about this, we keep validating these experiences, you know, it becomes more real the more you talk about it. And I just think we can sort of conjure this new, you know, this new reality of medicine that actually cares for women into being just by talking about it more and insisting that this is a real phenomenon, that it's happening, that, you know, it's not good enough.
Perfect. Yeah. And what makes you happy, and where is your happy place?
I definitely, I mean, this is so predictable, but I really love bookshops. I love the colors. I love how books smell. And I love the idea that there's just hundreds of ideas, you know, just waiting to be discovered. So yeah, it's definitely bookshops are my happy place.
I have to apologize. I read your book on my Kindle.
No.
No, I'll admit. Some people might find it. I was in a Zoom meeting during lockdown, and I color coded my books, which is really a bit obsessive, I know. But yeah, I do read partly on Kindle. And yeah, the Kindle offer on your book was much cheaper, so I must admit that's why I did it. So I apologize for
Fair
doing that.
enough. However you get, you know, access, it's
It
fair enough.
worked.
Yeah.
It worked. So my very last question: what advice would you give your younger self?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think actually it's trust your gut, trust your kind of intuition. I think, yeah, you know, there's always a lot of voices, least of all kind of sexist voices telling you what you should be, what you should be doing, and, you know, trusting your intuition and really kind of cultivating that kind of confidence isn't something that's really encouraged in society. But I think it's always led me in the right direction eventually. And I could have sort of spared myself a lot of pain and anguish just by, yeah, trusting my gut. So I think that would be it. Yeah.
I love that. I think that's really great. So, Marieke, I wanted to thank you hugely for writing a wonderful book, and I can't wait to read your The Woman on the Chaise Lounge is ready calling me.
Love
And
it.
and it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, and I wish you all the luck with
Likewise.
your next venture. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Joyce. Thanks.